Wright Field, Ohio, August 1946. 3 scientists found fused with the laboratory walls, their flesh melded with metal, their mouths frozen mid-scream as they aged decades in seconds, all because they touched fragments of Nazi technology that doesn't exist yet. Welcome to the War Maestro's archive, where tonight I bring you the terrifying truth of Operation Chronos, a weapon that doesn't just kill you, it erases you from time itself. Captain James Sullivan stared at the blackened fragments laid out on the laboratory table, each piece sealed in its own containment vessel. The metal, if you could call it that, seemed to drink in the harsh fluorescent light of the secure research bunker beneath Wright Field. 7 fragments in total, recovered from the ruins of Complex 7 in Poland, each bearing the same strange properties: fluctuating mass, unpredictable radioactivity, and occasional bursts of that violet glow described in Carter's fragmented reports. Sullivan removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. 3 days without sleep, reviewing Operation Lusty's most classified findings, the Luftwaffe's secret technologies that the American military was desperate to understand before the Soviets could replicate them. "They don't match any known element," Dr. Werner said softly, his German accent still thick, despite months working under Operation Paperclip. The physicist's hands trembled as he adjusted settings on the measuring equipment. "Not steel, not aluminum, not any alloy we've tested. The molecular structure, it shifts when we're not observing it." Sullivan nodded, leafing through Captain Carter's final report, what remained of it. Most pages were heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out by military intelligence. What survived painted a fragmented picture of Die Glocke, a Nazi wonder weapon that manipulated time itself. "Carter's team never returned," Sullivan murmured. "Official report claims the complex was destroyed by retreating Germans, but these fragments tell a different story." Werner flinched at the name. "I knew Ernst Schaefer, the lead scientist on Die Glocke. Brilliant man. I attended his funeral last week." Sullivan looked up sharply. "Funeral? Schaefer is alive. He's being held at Fort Detrick for debriefing." Werner's face drained of color. "That's impossible. I identified his body myself. Apparent suicide. Aged decades overnight. The autopsy report said his cellular structure had somehow degraded, as if his timeline had been accelerated." Sullivan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Before he could respond, Lieutenant Harris burst into the lab, clutching a folder marked "Eyes Only." "Sir," Harris said, breathless, "we've finished analyzing the personnel records from Complex 7. There's something you need to see." Sullivan flipped open the folder. Inside were photographs of dog tags recovered from the site, their metal warped but the names still legible. He froze when he reached the 3rd image. "This can't be right," he whispered. The tag belonged to a Sergeant James Sullivan, Jr., U.S. Army Air Forces. Service number, blood type, religion, all matching his own, except for the name suffix. Sullivan had no children. He wasn't even married. The date of birth listed was June 17th, 1947. 9 months in the future. The interrogation room in Wright Field's subterranean B7 sector was deliberately uncomfortable. Harsh lighting, metal chair bolted to the floor, and temperatures kept just below comfortable. Sullivan studied the man across the table. Dr. Heinz Kreuger, former SS Untersturmführer, now a reluctant guest of the United States government under Operation Paperclip. Unlike most Nazi scientists eager to prove their worth to their American captors, Kreuger had to be extracted forcibly from Argentina. His expertise in theoretical physics made him valuable enough to overlook his documented involvement in concentration camp experiments. "You worked with Schaefer on Die Glocke," Sullivan said. Not a question, but a statement. He slid one of the containment vessels across the table. Inside, a fragment no larger than a cigarette case pulsed with that telltale violet glow. Kruger recoiled visibly, pushing his chair back until it scraped against the wall. "Put that away," he hissed, eyes wide with genuine terror. "It sees you when you look at it." Sullivan didn't move the container, but made a note in his file. "Explain what you mean by, 'it sees you.'" Krieger's gaze darted between Sullivan and the fragment. His fingers twitched in an unconscious rhythm, matching the pulsing light. "We thought we were building a propulsion system, something to bend space, create a shortcut. Kamler saw it as a weapon. Neither understood." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Die Glocke wasn't a machine. It was a window, and something looked back through it." Sullivan maintained his professional demeanor, though the hairs on his arms stood on end. The report mentions temporal displacement effects, aging, de-aging, subjects partially embedded in solid matter. "Side effects." Kruger's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria, like calling a bullet wound a side effect of being shot. "Time rejected us, Captain Sullivan. It has antibodies against paradox. We tore a hole in something fundamental, and it bled through." Sullivan slid forward a photograph of the dog tags, his son's dog tags, watching Kruger carefully. "Ah," the German scientist nodded, unsurprised. "You've found your connection. It always finds one, you know. A thread to pull." He tapped the date of birth on the photograph. "June 17th, 1947. Have you told her yet?" Sullivan's mouth went dry. "Told who? Your wife, or ... Kruger cocked his head, studying Sullivan's expression. "Not your wife yet, I suppose. Rebecca Martin, the nurse you'll meet next month when you check into the infirmary with radiation exposure symptoms." His smile was ghastly. "You don't even know her name yet, do you? But the bell does. It knows your son. It knows your future." Sullivan fought to keep his hands steady. He'd never heard the name Rebecca Martin before, yet it triggered something, a fleeting sense of familiarity, like a half-remembered dream. "These fragments," Sullivan pressed, struggling to maintain control of the interrogation. "What happens if we reassemble them?" Kreuger's eyes widened. "You're already trying, aren't you? Verdammt." He slammed his palm on the table. "The Americans are as arrogant as we were. The Soviets, too. Everyone wants the power without understanding the price." He pointed a trembling finger at the glowing fragment. "Each piece remembers what it was. Each piece calls to the others." Before Sullivan could respond, the overhead lights flickered. The fragment in its container pulsed brightly, then dimmed completely. In that moment of darkness, Sullivan felt something brush against his consciousness. A presence, familiar yet alien. And in the brief flash when the lights returned, he thought he saw a third figure sitting at the table. A boy, perhaps 16, in a military uniform, with Sullivan's eyes and a stranger's smile. Then the vision was gone, and Kruger was staring at him with a mixture of pity and recognition. "It's chosen you already," he whispered. "I can see it in your eyes, the temporal echo. You've seen him, haven't you? Across moments? Your son who doesn't exist yet." Sullivan's sleep came in brutal fragments that night. In one dream, he held a newborn wrapped in military-issue blankets, the child's eyes prematurely aware, focusing on him with uncanny recognition. In another, he stood at a graveside, watching as they lowered a flag-draped coffin into red clay soil. The name on the headstone, James Sullivan, Jr., 1947 to 1963, died in service. He woke, gasping at 03:47 hours, sheets drenched with sweat and something else, a viscous metallic fluid that caught the moonlight with an unmistakable violet sheen. It smeared between his fingers like mercury. but evaporated into nothing when he tried to collect it in his palm, leaving only the scent of ozone and scorched metal. 2 hours later, Sullivan stood before Colonel Warren Hayes in the briefing room at Wright Field's Aeronautical Research Center. 3 other people were present: Werner, doctor; Eleanor Reed, the project's medical supervisor; and a nurse Sullivan had never met before. A woman with auburn hair and steady hands who was drawing blood from Werner's arm. Rebecca Martin, Hayes introduced her casually, on loan from the medical division. We need frequent blood monitoring given the radiation concerns. Sullivan felt the air leave his lungs. Rebecca Martin, the name Krieger had plucked from his future. Progress report on Project Chronos, Hayes demanded, lighting his pipe, oblivious to Sullivan's shock. Werner cleared his throat. We've successfully mapped the electromagnetic signatures of all 7 fragments. They appear to communicate with each other when in proximity. When arranged in certain configurations, they emit coordinated pulses, almost like a code. The reassembly chamber is nearly complete, added Hayes, tapping classified blueprints on the table. If these fragments are pieces of a propulsion system as we suspect, the strategic implications could eclipse even the Manhattan Project. And the incidents? Sullivan asked, forcing himself to look away from Nurse Martin. Dr. Reed's clinical tone couldn't disguise her unease. 3 researchers reporting time perception anomalies, 2 cases of rapid aging confined to specific body parts. She hesitated. And Technician Davis disappeared entirely during last night's shift. Disappeared? Hayes raised an eyebrow. Security footage shows him working at his station, then simply gone. His coffee remained, half full, still warm when security checked. Reed handed Sullivan a photograph. We found this embedded in the workbench where he was sitting. Sullivan examined the image. A military ID belonging to Private Anthony Davis, issued by the United States Space Force. The issue date was April 2041. Space Force, Hayes scoffed. Some kind of joke? No joke, sir, Sullivan said quietly. The metal composition of this ID matches the Glocke fragments. It's authentic, just not from our time. As the meeting concluded, Sullivan remained behind, studying the blueprints for the reassembly chamber. A shadow fell across the table, Nurse Martin collecting blood sample vials. I understand you'll be next for testing, Captain, she said with professional detachment. Dr. Reed wants baseline readings from everyone on the project. Sullivan met her eyes, searching for any hint of recognition, any sign that she too was experiencing temporal echoes. There was nothing but the cool efficiency of a medical professional. Rebecca, he said, testing the name on his tongue. Have we met before? She glanced up, briefly puzzled. No, Captain. I was transferred here yesterday. She gathered her supplies, then paused. Though it's strange. What is? I had a dream about this place last night, and you were in it. She gave a self-conscious smile. Isn't that odd? Must have seen your photo in the personnel files. As she left, Sullivan noticed violet-tinged condensation forming on the metal door handle where her fingers had touched it. The bell was reaching through time, creating connections that shouldn't exist yet. And somehow, his unborn son was at the center of it all. Sullivan entered Lab 7 wearing the new protective gear, lead-lined gloves, a modified gas mask, and a chrono radiation badge that Werner's team had developed. The fragments were now arranged in the reassembly chamber, a reinforced concrete pit surrounded by copper coils that mimicked Schaefer's original containment system. Captain Sullivan, Werner nodded, his once steady hands now constantly trembling. The physicist had aged visibly in the past week, hair thinning, skin sallow, eyes sunken. Yet according to his personnel file, the man was only 36. Come to observe today's test? To stop it, Sullivan said, placing Carter's full decoded report on the workbench. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights breaking the additional encryption layers, revealing sections deliberately hidden from military leadership. Carter didn't just witness temporal anomalies. He saw this exact moment, us, here, making the same mistake the Nazis made. Werner glanced nervously at the armed MPs stationed by the door. The colonel authorized the power test. The fragments have been almost completely reassembled. We just need to... Listen to me, Sullivan hissed, keeping his voice low. The bell isn't a weapon or a propulsion system. According to Carter, it's a temporal parasite. It feeds on innovation, on human progress. The Nazis didn't create it. They found it. Werner hesitated. That's mysticism, not physics. Sullivan rolled up his sleeve, revealing a patch of aged skin on his forearm, wrinkled, liver-spotted, belonging to a man decades older. It appeared this morning, after I dreamed about my son's grave. His death date was 1963. Werner stared, scientific detachment wavering. Your son doesn't exist. Not yet, but the bell knows he will. It's already connected to him, to all of us involved in this project. It's creating temporal bonds, tethers to ensure its own creation. Even if that were true, Werner said, voice shaking, how could we possibly prove it? The doors to Lab 7 opened, and Rebecca Martin entered, pushing a medical cart. Blood samples, gentlemen, she announced. As she approached, the fragments in the chamber began to pulse in unison, their violet light intensifying. Sullivan noticed something horrifying. Rebecca's shadow on the wall behind her didn't match her form. Instead, it showed the silhouette of a pregnant woman. Rebecca, Sullivan said carefully, how long have you been assigned to this project? 3 days, Captain, she answered, preparing a syringe. And have you been experiencing any unusual dreams? Any strange physical symptoms? She hesitated, then rolled up her sleeve to reveal a birthmark on her arm, a perfect circle surrounded by 7 smaller circles, the exact configuration of the bell fragments in the reassembly chamber. I've had this since birth, she said quietly. My mother always called it my wheel of fortune. But yesterday it started changing. The circles seemed to be moving closer together. Werner made a strangled sound. That's the same pattern as our assembly blueprint? How could she possibly? A harsh buzzing interrupted them as the radiation alarms triggered. The fragments had begun moving on their own, floating inches above their containment cradles, spinning slowly like miniature planets around a central axis. It's happening again, Sullivan whispered, memories of Carter's report flashing through his mind. The fragments were self-assembling, just as they had in Complex 7 before the disaster. Rebecca suddenly doubled over in pain, clutching her abdomen. Something's wrong, she gasped. When she straightened, her shadow had changed again, now clearly showing a woman holding an infant. Get her out of here, Sullivan ordered an MP. But as the soldier approached Rebecca, he jerked back with a cry of pain. The skin on his hand was aging rapidly where he'd touched her arm, withering to that of an old man's in seconds. No one touches her, Sullivan amended, fighting rising panic. Rebecca, you need to leave this room immediately. I can't, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He won't let me. Who won't let you? Her eyes, suddenly ancient with knowledge that didn't belong to her, met his. Our son, James, he needs to be born. Alarms blared throughout Wright Field's underground complex as the fragments spun faster, violet light spilling from their surfaces in pulsing waves. Personnel evacuated in ordered chaos, boots pounding concrete as MPs directed scientists toward emergency exits. Sullivan remained with Rebecca, who stood transfixed before the assembling bell, her body rigid as tears streamed down her face. "What do you mean? He needs to be born," Sullivan demanded, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Who's controlling you?" "Not controlling," she whispered, her voice overlapping with a child's. "Existing. Through me. Through you. Through the bell." Her hands moved to her stomach in an instinctively protective gesture. "He dies without this moment. He needs the bell to survive." The fragments had fully assembled themselves now, hovering in the unmistakable bell shape from Schaefer's diagrams. The copper coils surrounding the chamber began to glow, drawing power from nowhere, vibrating at frequencies that made Sullivan's teeth ache. "Captain!" Colonel Hayes stormed into the laboratory, flanked by armed security. "What the hell is happening here? I gave no authorization to power the assembly." "It's powering itself, sir," Sullivan replied, positioning himself between the soldiers and Rebecca. "Sir, we need to evacuate the entire facility. Carter's report warned that once the bell self-assembles, temporal containment fails within minutes." Hayes's face flushed with anger. "I'm not abandoning $1 billion project because of some Nazi ghost story. Shut it down." He shoved past Sullivan, reaching for the emergency cutoff switch on the control panel. "Sir, don't..." Sullivan lunged for the colonel, but too late. The moment Hayes's hand touched the switch, Sullivan witnessed what the others couldn't see: the colonel's flesh aging rapidly upon contact, decades of decay compressed into seconds. Hayes screamed as his hand withered to bone, the effect traveling up his arm toward his torso. "Get back!" Sullivan shouted to the remaining personnel, but they stood frozen in horror, watching as their commanding officer collapsed to his knees, his body now resembling a mummified corpse, while still screaming through desiccated vocal cords. The bell's rotation reached a fever pitch, the violet light intensifying until it hurt to look at directly. Sullivan felt a tugging sensation in his chest, as if some essential part of him was being pulled toward the device. His aged arm, previously just a patch of elderly skin, had begun to separate at the molecular level, particles streaming toward the bell like iron filings to a magnet. "It's calling to you," Rebecca said, her eyes reflecting the bell's light. "Just as it calls to our son." She took Sullivan's hand, placing it on her abdomen. "Can you feel him? Existing and not existing, born and unborn." Sullivan felt a jolt of connection, a presence both alien and intimately familiar pulsing beneath his palm. The sensation brought a flood of fragmented memories: teaching a boy to fish, attending a military academy graduation, identifying remains after a classified operation gone wrong, a lifetime of moments with a son he hadn't yet conceived. "I don't understand," Sullivan whispered. "What does he want from us?" The bell suddenly stopped spinning, hovering motionless in mid-air. The violet light concentrated, forming a perfect circle on the chamber wall, a doorway of light leading elsewhere, elsewhen. Through this portal, Sullivan glimpsed a desert landscape under night sky, wreckage scattered across sand. And standing amid the debris, examining what appeared to be fragments of the bell itself, was a figure Sullivan recognized from photographs. Captain Carter, somehow alive, moving with purpose among the twisted metal. "Roswell," Sullivan breathed, the pieces clicking into place. "The bell goes to Roswell." Rebecca nodded, her eyes now showing the same ancient knowledge he'd seen in Kruger. "July 7th, 1947, where it all begins again." She took Sullivan's hand, guiding it toward the light. "Our son will be born 1 month after the crash. These events must happen, James. This is the point of no return." "We have to destroy it," Sullivan said, tearing his gaze away from the portal. "Whatever this thing wants, Whatever it's doing to us, it has to end here. He lunged for the emergency detonation panel, a failsafe installed after reviewing Carter's report. Nuke protocol. Total destruction of the facility if containment failed. His fingers were inches from the switch when he felt a hand grab his wrist. Rebecca, her grip unnaturally strong. "You've already tried," she said, her voice layered with echoes of other attempts. "You always try, and you always fail." The laboratory around them continued to degrade, concrete walls revealing glimpses of other times and places like windows opening in reality itself. Through one such tier, Sullivan witnessed a Soviet laboratory where scientists huddled around their own assembly of Bell fragments. Through another, he saw the ruins of Wright Field decades hence, overgrown and abandoned. A new alarm sounded, different from the evacuation siren, more urgent. The facility's nuclear containment failsafe had activated. In 10 minutes, the entire underground complex would be flooded with radiation to prevent whatever was happening from spreading. "We need to evacuate," Sullivan said, reaching for the emergency phone. "No one's answering," Rebecca said with certainty. "They've already initiated the Chronos containment protocol. This section has been quarantined and will be permanently sealed." As if to confirm her words, Sullivan heard the heavy thunk of blast doors closing throughout the facility. They were being entombed alive. Werner emerged from behind an overturned workstation, his face streaked with blood from a head wound. "Sullivan," he shouted, barely audible over the alarms. "What's happening to her?" Sullivan turned to see Rebecca's body becoming translucent, her outline blurring as the bell pulsed in sync with her heartbeat. Between flashes, Sullivan glimpsed a child within her, a fetus, fully formed, its tiny hand reaching outward, its eyes open and aware. "She's carrying him already," Werner whispered, scientific detachment shattered by terror. "How is that possible? She wasn't pregnant this morning." "Time isn't linear here anymore," Sullivan said, understanding flooding him as the bell's influence deepened. "It's happening now because it always happened, because it will happen." Through the portal, Carter had noticed them. The captain looked up from the wreckage in the desert, his eyes widening in recognition, despite the impossibility of seeing through time itself. His lips moved in a silent warning, pointing urgently at the bell. "He's trying to tell us something," Sullivan said, stepping closer to the threshold. Rebecca seized his arm, her fingers sinking into his flesh like hot metal into wax. Where they touched, their bodies merged briefly, skin, muscle, and bone fusing before separating painfully. "If you cross without protection, you'll die," she warned. "The temporal transition will tear you apart." "But Carter survived," Sullivan argued, fixated on the figure in the desert. "Not as you know him," Werner said, his scientific mind still grasping for understanding. "Look at his eyes." Sullivan peered closer and felt ice flood his veins. Carter's eyes reflected the same violet light as the bell, his pupils elongated into inhuman shapes. Whatever had crossed from Complex 7 to the Roswell desert wasn't entirely Carter anymore. The countdown to radiation flooding reached 5 minutes. The bell began to move toward the portal, its surface becoming completely fluid, rippling with patterns that hurt the eyes. "It's leaving," Sullivan realized. "It's going to Roswell, just like in Carter's timeline." "And taking part of us with it," Rebecca said, as patches of her skin began to flake away into glittering particles drawn toward the bell. She didn't scream or show pain, only a terrible acceptance. "Our son needs an anchor on both sides, a father here, a mother there." Sullivan felt his own body responding, molecules resonating with the same frequency as the device. The aged portions of his skin began to crumble into dust that swirled toward the bell. He understood with sudden, horrific clarity. The bell wasn't just a machine or a weapon, but a living bridge between moments, requiring human components to maintain its existence across time. "Rebecca, we have to fight this," he begged, reaching for her even as parts of him were being claimed. Her smile was serene, inhuman, as the transformation accelerated. "There's no fighting time, James. There's only ensuring our son survives it." The bell's violet tendrils coiled around Sullivan and Rebecca, lifting them inches off the ground. Their bodies began to change, not aging like Hayes or fading like the others, but transforming. Sullivan's skin took on a metallic sheen, veins glowing with the same light that pulsed from the bell. Rebecca's abdomen became translucent, revealing the impossible child growing within her, its tiny form pulsing in sync with the bell. "You can't fight it," Werner shouted over the alarms, backing away in horror. "But you can control where it goes." Sullivan understood suddenly. "The control device," he gasped through lips that were partly metal. "Schaefer's original design." Werner fumbled in his coat, retrieving a circular device with 7 dials arranged around its circumference. "Recovered from Complex 7. I've been studying it, but couldn't make it function." He slid it across the floor toward Sullivan. "Maybe it'll respond to you now." Sullivan's transforming fingers closed around the device. The metal felt alive, responding to his touch, dials spinning on their own before settling into new configurations. Knowledge flooded his consciousness. Schaefer's equations, Carter's experiences, futures that hadn't happened yet. "I can direct the jump," Sullivan realized. "Send it somewhere isolated, somewhere it can't spread." "The desert," Rebecca whispered, her voice barely human now. "Roswell, July 1947, where Carter waits." Through the portal, Carter seemed to understand what was happening. He began clearing an area in the desert, drawing symbols in the sand that matched equations appearing in Sullivan's mind. The radiation countdown reached 1 minute. The bell started moving toward the portal, pulling them with it. Sullivan felt his body being unmade at the molecular level, particle by particle, as the device prepared them for temporal transition. "Rebecca," he said, reaching for her hand as both their bodies continued to transform. "I don't understand. Why our son? Why us?" Her smile was radiant despite her increasingly inhuman appearance. "Blood calls to blood across time, James. The bell didn't choose us randomly. Carter was your father's cousin. Schaefer was my great-uncle. We were always going to be here." Sullivan felt a chill deeper than the physical pain of transformation. "A family curse." "A family responsibility," she corrected, as portions of her body dissolved into the bell's surface. "Our son will be born to guard it, to understand it, to ensure it remains dormant. And us? Parts of us will cross with it. Parts will remain, neither fully here nor there." The bell passed through the portal, dragging them in its wake. Sullivan felt himself stretching across time, experiencing his birth and death simultaneously. In that eternal moment of transition, he glimpsed the truth. The bell hadn't been created by the Nazis or discovered by them. It had created itself, using human ingenuity across decades to ensure its own existence. And his son, James Sullivan Jr., would be its lifelong guardian, carrying within his DNA the key to both controlling and containing it. The radiation flooded the chamber, but Sullivan was already partly elsewhere. His consciousness split between Wright Field and the Roswell desert. He saw Werner sealing the blast doors, documenting what he'd witnessed. He saw Carter welcoming the bell's arrival, his transformed body recognizing its kin. He saw Rebecca's form reconstituting in the desert sand, changed but alive, cradling their still-growing child. And he saw his son's life unfolding: birth in a military hospital, childhood on secure bases, education at classified facilities, and eventually assignment to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the renamed Wright Field. There, in 1963, James Jr. would die stopping another attempted activation of the bell, fulfilling the grave dream Sullivan had experienced. The cycle would continue, but not unbroken. Each iteration, each family sacrifice, bought humanity time, because the alternative, the bell fully awakening, was unthinkable. 3 weeks after the Wright Field incident, a classified memo reached President Truman's desk. Operation Chronos terminated following catastrophic containment failure. 7 casualties confirmed. Facility permanently sealed. Surviving artifacts transported to Roswell Army Airfield for Project MOGUL integration. A separate document, eyes only for the Joint Chiefs, contained a single paragraph. Captain Sullivan's final transmission indicates temporal displacement, not destruction. Recommend establishment of multi-generational monitoring protocol. Blood relatives to be tracked and recruited for oversight duties. Codename: Family Bell. If this transmission from the War Maestro's archive reached you across time, consider it your recruitment notice. Check your timepiece. Make sure it's ticking forward, not backward, and subscribe to access more classified files from history's darkest corners. Activate that notification bell. After all, temporal anomalies can strike at any moment, and you won't want to miss our next revelation. Remember, some witnesses are still out there, scattered across different moments in time, waiting to share their stories. The War Maestro's archive stands ready to receive your testimony.